If you've ever felt curious about the Quran, but didn't quite know where to start, or maybe even felt a little intimidated by it, well, you are definitely not alone. For most non-Muslims, this text is. It's a complete mystery. We really only know it through media headlines, through conflict. It just feels like this black box.
And that anxiety, when it's coupled with a real lack of acquaintance with the actual text, it just creates the perfect storm for misunderstanding.
Right.
So for this deep dive, our mission is really to offer you a way past that anxiety. We're going to use a literary and a historical approach to read the Quran.
Okay.
And by doing that, we can sort of shift it away from the frame of theological authority and instead see it as this really sophisticated literary text that's part of a much larger shared civilization, one that includes the Bible.
That reframing seems absolutely essential because the default way we approach it now is, well, it's so frustrating for anyone new to it. We kind of assume it has this one simple meaning,
right?
But then you pick up a translation, you start at page 1, and you are just immediately lost.
You're immediately lost. And what's so fascinating is that the structural problem, and it starts right there on page 1. The official arrangement of the 114 suras or chapters, well, it puts the longest and the latest parts of the text right at the very front.
The ones dealing with all the complex legal issues.
Exactly. So reading the Quran that way is, and this is not an exaggeration, it's like starting a novel by reading the last chapter first. It's genuinely confusing.
So I start at the beginning. I get completely lost in these long, dense passages. I can't follow the vocabulary or the themes, and I just give up. And that frustration, as the sources talk about, it can also feed a much more hostile way of reading, too.
Oh, it absolutely does. The hostile approach is like using a blunt instrument. It's really an ignorance multiplier.
How so?
People will take isolated verses completely out of context, both their textual context and their historical one, give them the most extreme interpretation you can imagine, and then claim that over 1 billion Muslims just robotically follow that reading.
Without any nuance.
Without any nuance at all. And it produces this massive amount of misinformation, but it also completely hides the actual complexity and the literary beauty of the text itself.
Okay, so we need a better tool. For anyone who's genuinely curious, what's the solution? You mentioned a literary and historical approach from scholars like Carl W. Ernst.
That's the one.
But what does that mean in practice? How do we actually, rearrange the text so that it makes sense?
Well, the key is the chronological method. We simply follow the sequence of delivery. This is based on a structure first proposed by Theodor Noldeck about 150 years ago. He organized the text into 4 main periods, the early, middle, and later Meccan periods, and then that's followed by the Medinan period.
That seems like a huge project, but I can only imagine that reading it that way must reveal these incredible stylistic differences that we completely miss otherwise.
You're right. It reveals a total transformation. I mean, in style and in function. The early Meccan suras, the first ones revealed, are incredibly short, rhythmic, really powerful.
Almost like poems?
Very much so. They were really designed for the worship services of a very small and very pressured community. Think of themes like creation, judgment, personal piety. They're meant to be chanted, to be felt.
And then the Medinan suras, the ones that came later, that must have been a totally different experience for listeners because by then, Muhammad had a whole community.
Precisely. The Medinan suras are lengthy, they're much more prosaic, and they're dealing with community building, with legal questions, with debates, with other religious groups, Jews and Christians. The text's function literally shifts from existential devotion to a set of governing principles for a community trying to survive.
So seeing it chronologically isn't just a bit of historical trivia. It actually shows how the text developed over time in constant, you call it dialogical communication with its audience.
That is the crucial insight, yes. This approach lets you see the different parts of the text, the short, fiery verses versus the long, legal ones, not as contradictions, but as tensions that are mediated by the structure itself. You don't have to see them as inconsistencies that need to be explained away.
Explained away by something like the doctrine of abrogation.
Exactly.
Can you just unpack abrogation for us really quickly? I feel like that's a term that gets thrown around a lot, often by hostile critics.
Sure. Abrogation is a theological idea that developed later on. It basically says that if 2 verses seem to contradict each other, the verse that was revealed later cancels out or abrogates the earlier one.
So it's a way to keep the text perfectly consistent.
It's a theological mechanism for consistency. But the chronological reading says, hold on, we don't have to cancel anything out. We can hold both of these ideas, these different emphases, in tension, and just see them as different stages of development.
Okay, that makes so much sense. And that structural discussion, it leads right into context. I mean, who were they talking to in Medina? The Quran has so often been treated as this completely foreign, exotic text in the West.
Right.
But the sources you're drawing from show that it's actually deeply, deeply engaged with the religious literature of its time.
It's aimed at an audience that was keenly aware of a huge range of ancient religious writing, especially the Bible. And the relationship between the Quran and the Bible, it's not borrowing or plagiarism, which is what you hear from critics.
So what is it?
The scholarly term is prophetic rewriting.
Prophetic rewriting, what does that actually look like?
It's the same thing we see happening all through the Bible itself. I mean,
Yeah.
think about the New Testament. It completely rereads the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
It finds Christological meaning everywhere. And even within the Hebrew Bible, a later prophet like Deutero-Isaiah will revise earlier prophecy. The Quran is just stepping into that existing tradition. It's telling familiar stories, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, but it's claiming them for a new, universal monotheistic vision.
So why did later Muslim traditions seem to downplay or disregard those biblical connections? Why frame it as something totally separate?
That really was a conscious theological decision made by later authorities. They developed the idea that the biblical texts were corrupted. The term is tarif. And that provided a really easy way to sort of firewall the Quran from earlier scriptures. It ensured its own unique final authority.
But the early text itself tells a different story.
The early textual evidence shows a deep, deep familiarity.
So if we look at those Medinan suras, you mentioned 3, 4, and 5, what's the specific evidence of that familiarity with Christianity and Judaism, beyond just mentioning names like Jesus and Moses?
The evidence is just overwhelming that Christians were incredibly important conversation partners, maybe even more so than the traditional biographies let on. The Quran shows this detailed knowledge of the actual ritual performance of a Christian worship service.
Wait, down to the actual prayers.
Down to the actual canticles used. We see echoes of the Magnificat and the Benedictus, these are New Testament psalms, essentially being quoted and then revised in suras 3 and 5.
So the Magnificat, that's Mary's prayer from the Gospel of Luke.
It is. It's that powerful prayer where Mary praises God's power. The Quran echoes that feeling, but it transforms her words into this much broader proclamation about divine favor that goes beyond any one religious community. It assumes you know the Christian context, but then it gives you a fresh perspective on Jesus and Mary.
That detail about the canticles, it really makes you wonder about the audience in Medina. Were the religious lines as sharp back then as we imagine them today?
Not at all. The historical audience, who are called the believers, was incredibly fluid. The evidence really supports the idea that this community included not just converted pagans, but probably Jews and Christians as well. We have to be so careful not to project our modern, rigid religious identities back onto 7th century Arabia.
Okay, this is already opening up so much. But let's shift to another tool, one you mentioned that helps unlock the internal structure of those long Medinan suras, ring composition.
Yes. Ring composition is an ancient literary structure. You find it all across Near Eastern literature, including in parts of the Bible. It's a symmetrical organization.
Symmetrical how?
A text is built around a central point. And the sections leading up to that point are mirrored almost exactly by the sections that follow it. You can think of it like ABC, then you have your main point, X, and then this is followed by C prime, B prime, A prime.
So the whole thing is balanced, like looking in a mirror.
Exactly like a mirror. And once you see that symmetry, it gives you a profound insight into the meaning, especially in those long, complicated suras. It basically tells you where the author has placed the most important points of emphasis. The structure itself is the key.
So it's a kind of interpretive map. The central points have priority, and they give you the principles to understand all the surrounding statements that might seem to conflict.
Precisely. When you analyze these suras rhetorically, the most crucial messages, they're not at the beginning, they're not at the end, they emerge literally at the center. The message is structurally embedded.
Okay, so this is the crucial question. When scholars apply this analysis to those final late Medinan suras, the ones with some of the most challenging verses, what is the central point that keeps emerging?
It is the firm articulation of the principle of religious pluralism. That is the really stunning finding of this kind of structural analysis. These broad statements on the fact of religious pluralism. They literally hold the central places in the final suras of the Quran.
That is a stunning claim, especially given how the Quran is so often used today to argue for just the opposite, for exclusivity. What does that central message actually look like in the text?
Let's take Surah 5. It's likely one of the very last revelations the community received. And at its rhetorical center, its bullseye, you find this declaration: for everyone, we have established a law and a way. If God had wished, he would have made you a single community, but this was so, he might test you regarding what he sent you. So strive to be first in good deeds.
Wow. So religious pluralism is presented as divine intention. It's not some unfortunate accident.
Exactly.
And the command isn't to convert everyone. It's to compete in ethical excellence.
That is the core finding. The proper response to the diversity that God deliberately created is not conflict, but a competition in doing good. And reading the Qur'an this way, from this literary perspective, it really promises to increase communication between people from different backgrounds because you recognize this central message: let's meet on the field of ethics.
So the big takeaway here is that the frustration that so many people feel when they first pick up the Quran it's completely understandable. It's almost built into the canonical order.
It is.
But this literary and chronological approach, when you pair it with understanding these ancient structures like ring composition, it lets you, the reader, understand the text as it was first received.
Right, before all the layers of later interpretation were added, which kind of obscured its development and its vibrant dialogue with the world around it.
So the goal of this kind of humanistic study is to understand how the Quran functioned as a literary document in history.
Yes. And given the Quran's explicit central message of religious diversity, which is actually quite hard to find a direct parallel for in the biblical texts it's talking to, it leaves us with a real challenge. What does this commitment to ethical excellence over uniform belief challenge us to consider today about the very nature of revelation itself?